Salutations, one and all, and welcome to RWBY Revisited. In this entry, let's dissect the fight of Haven Academy. Now, when someone brings up how the choreography of this show has tended to fall by the wayside over the years, this is often the fight that comes to mind. So let's assess it, shall we? As usual, let's begin with examining each side's goal. Now, this fight could have easily been avoided. Cinder already had access to the Spring Maiden and the headmaster of Haven Academy in her pocket. She could have just walked in and gotten the relic. Instead, she decided that she wanted to pick a fight and possibly gain revenge on RWBY. Putting your personal desires ahead of the mission is a recipe for failure. Our main cast, however, are present because they were lured in by Lionheart's message. Their objective then becomes preventing their enemies from accessing the vault. But how do both factions go about this? Well, that part's not so great. Forgive me if I skip a few parts of this, but I'm mostly analyzing the fight itself, and there are a lot of instances where the characters just stop fighting and talk. If I were to play those sections, the copyright bots would be all over me, so I'll be forced to summarize those sections.
RWBY! Hello, boys and girls.
So after a brief back and forth with Crow and Raven, the latter opens up a portal via her semblance, and Cinder shoots a fireball through it. A couple of questions. Was Cinder just going to shoot that fireball through no matter what? What if Lionheart was on the other side, and she blasted him and killed him, thus preventing her from accessing the vault? She doesn't know how to get to it. That would be failure. But RWBY goes flying back from this, and I have to question just how much damage this attack did. At first, she acts like she's taken a substantial injury, but then she just gets up like it was nothing. This sort of thing is why I've never really liked the aura shields. We've got no way of really knowing just how much damage any character with one can withstand. This does, however, put Crow in a pretty bad position. He's the only adult accompanying the main cast, and is the only one with any great deal of experience. Yeah, you could argue that Ozma's also there, but he's a weird case being in Oscar's body. If you're Crow, you obviously don't want these kids to get hurt, but you also don't want a known agent of Salem to get her hands on a relic. This is just an all-around terrible position to be in.
The White Fang is prepping demolition and securing school grounds. No one's getting in. And no one's getting out.
Hazel then enters from behind them and closes the doors. This is portrayed as though this completely seals the main cast inside, but he's just one man. Even if he's skilled, rushing him with that many people leaves him very little opportunity to counterattack. Weiss's glyphs alone should be able to hold a single target in place for a few seconds, plenty of time to escape. But obviously the cast will choose to fight instead, considering the stakes.
Who are you again?
Cinder eggs them on, as she's wont to do, and Jaune, having at this point not emotionally matured, is baited into attacking her. I've never understood the supposed upgrade, air quotes, to his sword. It gains the ability to be longer by a few inches at most, and is way too broad. This is also part of its scabbard, and so I have to wonder why it doesn't fly off if swung quickly. That and the balance would be wonky. It's really just a downgrade. But Cinder blocks it without much apparent effort. The position she performs this block in is also janky. I get that she's supposed to be strong, but putting your arm at that angle is extremely counterproductive. It's a weak position, and she and Jaune just sort of hang there for no reason. Also, the only ones animated in this shot are Crow, Emerald, and Wren. Everyone else is just a static prop, except for Mercury, who does shift slightly. Why does everyone just freeze here? Even Jaune and Cinder just hold their position for a weirdly long period of time.
Jaune!
You're not getting near her.
But then RWBY is the only one to move, and for some reason, she decides to jump up, propelled by her weapon. RWBY, your semblance allows you to move incredibly quickly. Why wouldn't you just use that instead? It's better in every regard compared to whatever it was you were planning on doing. Emerald's then able to yank her out of the air, and yes, I know that realistic physics isn't something that this series goes for, but how can characters like Emerald and Ren make their weapons wrap around targets? There's no way that you could really do that if this were in reality. At least not with this setup. Emerald can even retract the chain on her weapon, which was previously wrapped around RWBY, who was lying on it. That would take a decent amount of force. Only now does Cinder decide to disengage her bind with Jaune, but as she closes the distance with him again, she leaves her body completely exposed. Just look at how she's positioned. If Jaune was quicker on the uptake, he'd have been able to strike her. Keep in mind that nobody else has made a move yet. I've said it before, and I'll say it every time this is relevant in a fight scene. Every character needs to be doing something. Unless a character is deliberately abstaining, or is too injured or incapacitated to continue, every character in a fight needs to be doing something at any given moment. This can be direct combat, accomplishing another objective, getting wounded away from the action, or any number of things. But a character should never just be standing there unless it's someone who doesn't know how to fight and is overwhelmed.
Hey there, Blondie. I'm thinking you owe me an apology for my leg, don't you think?
Yang slow jogs forward, but her way is barred by Mercury. The smug cretin gives her a one-liner, and it's the sort of thing that makes this sequence feel like the beginning of a fight in Mortal Kombat or the like. In a real fight, most people aren't going to just stand there in front of each other spouting dialogue. At least not someone who's fighting for keeps. They're going to jump in there. So Yang shouldn't have stopped in front of Mercury. Instead, she should have kept going and either smashed into him, or else he would have needed to evade. His guard isn't up, and he's not even in a proper stance. Yang's durable enough, unless the plot nerfs her, to take a hit, so she should at least be able to deal some damage to him.
Running away was one thing, but this, you've crossed the line.
Sorry, brother. Sometimes family disappoints you like that.
Crow and Raven then enter a bind, complete with dialogue. But there's a point that I'd like to bring up that I haven't heard anyone mention. If Raven wants Crow out of the picture, why not just create a portal underneath or behind him linked to Ty, and then knock him through it? He'd be stuck hundreds of miles away, and thus removed from the fight. Also, again, I know about the physics of this show, Crow's sword is absurdly huge, while Raven's is much closer to a realistic proportion. If we were being accurate, his weapon should just blast through a static block like what Raven's putting up. Also, Raven blocked with the edge of her weapon. Now, there's been plenty of debate about whether you should try to block with the edge of your weapon as opposed to the flat, but I just wanted to point out that Cinder blocked Jaune with the flat of her blade. Cinder's blades are disposable, as she conjures them, while Raven's require more resources to replace. Blocking with the edge will nick it, and I personally find nicks annoying to deal with. Cinder never has to worry about that, but Raven's been shown to store blades within her scabbard. Blocking with the edge isn't a fault or anything, it's just something I wanted to bring up. But the two engage in more dialogue, and do the whole Star Wars thing of just trying to push their blades towards each other. I can give Star Wars a bit of slack with that sort of thing, because lightsabers are supposed to be instant death if it hits you in the torso, but normal blades are not. You can pivot your blade around the point of contact with your opponent's weapon. Nobody in the vast majority of media ever tries this, and I have no idea why. Stop pushing, it won't do anything. Crow even puts his face right by the edge of Raven's blade. She could have easily hit him. But as Crow disengages, we can clearly see Weiss was just standing there, watching this whole thing go down with everyone else. She hasn't been attacked yet, meaning that she's just chosen to do nothing. Glyphs would be incredibly helpful to any of your friends here. Why haven't you used any? Crow also does an absurd block that would have no stability to it, while Raven attacks the area next to him. Look at where her blade is. Even if Crow hadn't done this weird handstand block, she would have missed him.
Holy Jesus. What is that? What the f*** is that?
Let's see what she really needs. I'm more than a name. Prove it.
But we continue with the Mortal Kombat intros, with Vernal taunting Weiss, who responds as a character in a fighting game would. Vernal's weapons are interesting, as they loosely resemble either katars or patas, also known as a gauntlet sword. The blades extend forward from the wrist, rather than being held upwards from the hand. This lets you do very powerful thrusts in a punching motion, but can sometimes make it more difficult to block from certain angles. Vernal's weapons don't make much use of this design, however, as they don't have a tip suited for thrusting. The blades are drastically curved, and while you could still do some damage via thrusting, this configuration isn't the best for it. Weiss moves to engage first, but her position is quite frankly awful. She leaves herself completely exposed as she rushes forward, and any attack she does from this position will be telegraphed. Seriously, her weapon is behind her. That's not something you ever want.
I don't wish to fight either of you.
Nor I.
But you will, you're with her.
Very well then.
Ren and Nora have a brief exchange with Hazel, but no fighting has happened between them yet, so we'll move on for now. Oscar then moves to confront Lionheart, who fires his weapon all of once at him. After that, he just proceeds to block Oscar's wild baseball bat swings. Really, those strikes are slow and very easy to see coming. You'd think that the headmaster of a Huntsman Academy and a member of Ozma's inner circle would be better at fighting than this. We cut back to Weiss, but in the background, we can see that RWBY is just swinging wildly at Emerald, who doesn't even need to move to dodge her. She just leans this way and that to avoid her. Oscar and Lionheart have also vanished. They should be visible from this angle, but they're nowhere to be seen. But Vernal oddly throws her weapons at Weiss 3 times, despite only having 2. No, really, count them. 1, 2, 3. I've said before that throwing your weapon is generally a bad move, but how did she pull off this feat of sorcery? Weiss is expending a ton of aura just jumping around on glyphs, not making any sort of counteroffensive. She then somehow gets flung into a column with no visible cause. I slowed this down to a quarter speed, and nothing hits her. She just gets hurled into it for no reason. She redirected a shot from Vernal, who somehow fired at her despite not having access to her weapons, and then just eats the post. She does manage to block another of Vernal's thrown weapons, and now we can see that they are inexplicably returning to her hand.
Excuse me, what?
Pardon? She doesn't have any power or tech that allows her to do this. Pyrrha's semblance allowed her to recall her weapons back to her, and I let Marrow's slide because it was a boomerang and maybe Atlas Tech could give it that property. But Vernal has nothing. Weiss uses a glyph to evade Vernal's following advance, but her position has completely changed. She had the column behind her a moment ago, but now she's got her back to the middle of the room. She didn't have a chance to move, as we saw her the whole time, so her position was inorganically adjusted for this shot. Vernal also horribly overswings her weapons. Just look at where her hands end up. That would have left you completely exposed if Weiss hadn't moved herself so far away. Weiss then conjures an ice wall and then tries to summon her Armagigas. I hate how far she jabs her weapon into the floor, as that would destroy the tip, and there's no reason for her to do so. Never has it been stated that she's needed to do this, and Winter doesn't need to do any sort of twirling or ground stabbing to create her summons. But somehow, Vernal creates some kind of giant energy beam that slices through the ice wall and the Armagigas, killing it in one hit.
I have several questions.
And you never thought to use this on anyone else in this fight. How did you even pull this off? Nobody else before or since has done this sort of thing. Even Penny's lasers were more direct fire beams and didn't appear to be as powerful as this. Weiss then eats a blade to the face, and Vernal just sort of stands there and makes a quip at her. Seriously, I actually laughed when she died. She only existed to be an irritant.
I'm starting to remember you. You're the dense one that can't tell when he's out of his league.
We then cut to Jaune, who falls down for some reason, and Cinder continues to taunt him. You'd think that she'd want to just cut him down and move on to RWBY, seeing as the latter was the one to injure her at the end of Season 3. But Jaune swings his sword like a lead pipe, and that swing was so telegraphed that even those who have yet to be born could see it. Cinder obviously has no trouble blocking it, and they again remain in the bind. Why this is, I suppose only they know.
Why are you doing this? Salem!
I don't care about Salem, but I owe Cinder everything.
RWBY then blocks Emerald shooting at her, and I would like to point out that, firstly, there is no way you'd be able to block bullets with that scythe, much less swing it around that quickly with no visible effort. But, that aside, some of Emerald's shots seem to be blanks. She shoots at RWBY many times, but several of these shots produce no visible impact, and RWBY doesn't move her weapon to block where they should have impacted her. I guess this is what happens when you get discounted ammo.
You want to fight with Pat? Be my guest.
But Emerald creates an illusion that distracts RWBY, and this shows why I consider illusions to be a top-tier power. If your enemy can't tell what's going on, beating them becomes a much simpler matter. Admittedly, RWBY should have noticed that it doesn't make any sense for Cinder to have just popped into existence right in front of her, and Emerald only manages to sweep her leg, so both of them dropped the ball here. Emerald a bit less so, but still, if your opponent is distracted, go for something more vital. We shift back to Weiss, who was almost taken out by RWBY's poor trigger discipline, and for some reason, she just stops to caress her weapon when her enemy is behind her. What was the game plan with that one? She and Vernal then have a bit of a back and forth, and I will give that it's a nice touch that Vernal is trying to reposition. Weiss is somehow able to deflect her shots, but I have to question why Vernal doesn't use that laser cleaver of doom that she did before. Strangely though, Weiss launches Vernal upwards, but then Vernal is somehow immediately back on the ground and in front of her again. Weiss again tries the weird ground stab, which is a terrible choice in this scenario, but for some reason Vernal just places her weapons against Weiss's. She then blasts Weiss with laser beams, and I have to question how these weapons function. They sometimes shoot normal projectiles, sometimes lasers, sometimes make a giant laser cutter, and it can somehow return to her when thrown. What is this insane level of tech, and why does no one else use it? How did Vernal even get something this advanced if she belongs to a bandit tribe in the middle of nowhere in Mistral? Atlas is the kingdom with all the tech, so how did something this powerful and advanced come into her hands? But Weiss's aura breaks, and she doesn't immediately fall unconscious, as many characters do in later seasons.
Are you gonna let her die too?
Stop messing with me!
If that's what you want.
We then shift back to Cinder and Jaune, who stop to look at this. Cinder taunts Jaune again, and then her sword bursts into flames. It looks impressive, but as I've stated before, heat and cold don't generally deal damage instantly. You'd need to remain in contact with them for a few seconds to start taking damage from them, so a flaming sword isn't as scary as it looks. You should be more concerned with lacerations and stab wounds. The two then rush each other, and as they do so, Emerald whiffs a swing at Ruby. The latter turns away from her opponent to witness this, which is always a terrible idea. That leaves you completely exposed. As the two charge, we can see that both are treating their weapons like baseball bats rather than swords. The whole point of the weapon is to keep it between you and your enemy. Don't just put it behind yourself like that. It isn't doing you any good. Ruby's silver eyes flare up, but she pays for her lack of focus by getting smacked on the back of the head by Emerald. Her aura doesn't flare up or break, so why is she rendered unconscious? That was one hit, and we've seen her and other characters take harder hits and be fine, so why was this different? Cinder then falls to her knees in pain from the brief flash though, and Jaune managed to monumentally ruin his chance. He thrusts his sword at her face, though she manages to avoid it. But somehow, he just flops to the ground like a dead fish.
You missed! How could you miss? He was 3 feet in front of you!
What? Why didn't you take a step forward? Why didn't you follow up the thrust with another strike? How did you just fall on the floor? I was more competent than that when I was a kid and got into my first fight.
Did you think you actually had a chance against me? You?
He then just lies on the ground like he was the one who was injured, and Cinder plants her foot on his midsection. I've seen this position a number of times across various media, but it's really a terrible spot to put yourself in. Cinder's right foot is on Jaune, so all he would need to do would be to grab her leg and twist his body to his left. That would at worst put Cinder off balance, or at best cause her to fall to the ground. She only has one foot on the ground, while Jaune has his whole body touching it, giving him much more leverage. That's how most fistfights end up in grappling, or why a dog has an advantage against you in a tug of war. The more points of contact with the ground you have, the more stable you are. Cinder here is very unstable, and Jaune could easily bring her to the ground with him.
You're just a failure with a death wish.
Instead, He just reaches weakly for his sword, which he somehow let go of.
If I die buying them time, then it's worth it. They're the ones that matter.
He then gives this selfless declaration. But do you know what would buy your friends more time? Getting back in there and giving it your all instead of lying on the ground like your spine's been removed. A shortcut follows this, where Hazel grabs Nora's hammer and throws her away instead of using it to smash her into the ground, as she did a needless jumping attack and gave up all of her leverage. Ren's strikes then produce no visible results whatsoever. Yang and Mercury appear to be evenly matched, but I personally have never liked axe kicks like Mercury's fond of. I've seen too many instances of people tearing up their knees by doing it wrong. Granted, he's got mechanical legs, so that alleviates that somewhat.
You think so?
But Jaune's sentiments prompt Cinder to create a spear to throw at Weiss, and Jaune just simply sits there screaming. Dude, you're not restrained in any way. Pick up your sword and stab her. Even simply grabbing her would be something. Do anything. Cinder, left unchallenged, then gives the weakest toss of a javelin I've ever seen in my life, and this impales Weiss all the way through the back and out her front. Now, I'm no doctor, but it looks like this would have gone through her intestines, maybe a lung. Either way, that's incredibly bad news. Being impaled anywhere is bad, obviously, but humans are fragile creatures compared to many members of the animal kingdom. It doesn't take much to end us, and this is most certainly fatal unless trained medical professionals can do something quickly. But everyone stops to witness this. You'd think that they'd be too absorbed in their own fights, or that their opponents wouldn't give them the chance to look over. But here we are. So Jaune realizes then that he can move, and runs over to Weiss, all while the action has been put on pause. Why is everyone just staring at this? Maybe Yang might be distracted for a moment by one of her team getting run through like that, but that's a big maybe. You shouldn't have time in a real fight to just look over at something else. Lionheart then elects to eat another telegraphed cudgel swing from Oscar and tumbles pathetically down the stairs. You're a headmaster of a combat school. How are you this bad at combat?
RWBY, get up! Get up! We need you!
Oscar then rushes over to the KO'd RWBY rather than the imminently dying Weiss, and strangely Nora approaches as well. What was going on with her and Ren fighting Hazel, and why has that just stopped? Hazel acted like he didn't want to fight at first, but he seemed to be thrashing Nora and Ren just fine a minute ago. But once Lionheart informs him that Oscar is Ozma, something rather bizarre happens.
You thought you could hide from me? You'll pay for what you did. You'll die over and over again.
Hazel jams dust crystals into his arms, and while I'm still no doctor, jamming something that size into yourself isn't something you just slap an ice pack on and call it a day. Now, I know that some will bring up that his semblance stops him from feeling pain, but that doesn't do anything about the damage itself. That's like destroying the check engine light in your car and saying that the problem's gone. We even have a shot of Crow watching this go down. Weren't you fighting Raven just now? Why has she let up?
Ozpin is here?
Is that a problem?
But speaking of Raven, she approaches Cinder from the opposite side of the room from Crow, meaning that they couldn't possibly have been fighting each other. So what then were they doing? If they weren't fighting each other, Then why weren't they assisting someone else on their side?
Stop them! We've got your team covered!
Cinder and company then take the elevator down to the vaults, but Nora's dialogue is completely nonsensical.
Stop them! We've got your team covered!
What? What the f?
Covered from what? Emotional trauma? Weiss is actively bleeding out, and RWBY is semi-conscious, but neither are being attacked, and you aren't doing anything for them except sitting there. Emerald and Mercury have literally vanished from the shot as well. Where are they supposed to be? Up in the rafters? And even if Yang were to go after Cinder, Raven, Vernal, and Lionheart, what's she going to do? That's a 4v1, one of whom is a maiden. Yes, Raven is a maiden as well, but nobody else knows this at present.
You want to get to them? You're going to have to get through all of us.
But Mercury and Emerald reappear from wherever it was they were and bar her way. Emerald then creates illusory copies of Mercury, but there's a problem with her strategy. The real Mercury hasn't moved, and the illusions all replicate his movements after he makes them, making it obvious which the real one is.
Ren, talk to me. This is bad.
This dialogue is atrocious. No duh, it's bad. Any other sage advice? Are you going to tell us that the sun's hot, or that water is wet? I'm not faulting the voice actors, it's just that these are completely abysmal lines. So Cinder, Vernal, and Raven ride down the elevator, removing them from this fight, and for the time being, Weiss and Jaune are removed as well. We then have a section of dialogue that I'm forced to skip because of the bots. Thank you, YouTube. But Hazel declares that Oscar's blood won't be on his hands, but Ozma's. That's not how murder works, you bumbling gorilla. Then again, intelligence was never a quality that Hazel possessed.
What was he talking about?
Tell him, Austin. Tell him how you killed her.
Crow then gets into the bind again, but this time with Hazel, who's using his arm. Okay, aura is supposed to have limits. Firstly, it should be weakened from the constant damage that Hazel's inflicting to himself with the dust crystals. Second, Crow's attacks should be depleting it further. Third, Crow, stop pushing against his arm. Perform a draw cut on it and launch another strike. Did you miss going to the gym today and are trying to make up for the missed reps on the bench press?
You can forgive me for what I'm about to do.
But then Hazel throws Crow away like trash, and we can see that Nora and Ren are doing absolutely nothing to help Yang. Hazel then throws some incredibly slow punches at Oscar, allowing him to easily evade. Lionheart tries to shoot at the kid, but is stopped by Crow. Honestly, Lionheart's weapon isn't that great. It takes far too long to fire, a problem shared with Ironwood's laser cannon. Delayed firing is a bad thing 9 times out of 10. If you're trying to fire your weapon, you need that damage now, not in a few seconds. On top of that, its projectiles are rather slow. Ozma then leaps around the room, with Hazel bumbling along after him. I get evading attacks from more powerful opponents. Back when I did martial arts, most of the people in my class were dudes easily over 6 feet, and none of them were slouches. So I learned very quickly how to stay just out of reach until the opportune moment. That said, Ozma, who's in control of Oscar right now, is using tons of energy to jump this high and far. You don't need to do all that. You only need to be just outside of their range until they overextend. Also, Oscar's body wouldn't have the physique or muscle memory of Ozma, so this should really be more difficult. He's able to land some hits, and even temporarily bring Hazel down, But a cane is not a particularly effective weapon. Those jabs you're doing would be so much more effective if there was a point on the end of your weapon, like a short spear. But after some more dialogue, in which Ren, Nora, and RWBY ignore the other two fights going on, we shift back to Yang, who's struggling to deal with Emerald's illusions. For some reason, Emerald creates a projection of Raven, who Yang saw go down the elevator and thus couldn't be here in front of her. Yang sees right through this inexplicable choice of illusions, and does manage to block Mercury's next two kicks. Unfortunately, she drops her guard after the second, leading to her taking 4 more and getting sent flying. Now, I get that Mercury has mechanical legs and can probably kick harder than normal, but Yang went up against a paladin mech. She should be able to keep her guard up against him. Crow has somehow gotten separated from Lionheart though, as he scores a hit on Oscar. How and why did you break off from him? Crow then shoves Oscar out of the path of Hazel's next attack, but then just stands there and takes it himself. Why didn't you keep moving, thus getting Oscar out of the way along with yourself? Why did you just push him instead of grabbing him and carrying him out of the way? Hazel then hits Crow so hard that he's deleted from the next shot, all while Ruby's just sat there watching. Pick a target, Ruby. Any target. Just do something.
Whatever you're doing, don't stop.
I won't.
Good.
She then removes Jean's hands, only to tell him to continue doing what he's doing. Why did you move his hands then?
Oscar needs help.
I'm on it.
Jaune and Weiss still need cover. No one's gonna touch him.
But only when she says something does Ren decide that he should be more than a bystander, and for some reason, Nora still wants to stay by Jaune and Weiss. You know what would cover them better? Attacking the remaining enemies in the room so that they couldn't interfere. You standing there makes it more likely that one of your friends, who so far you've left high and dry, will be overwhelmed, and then your attackers will converge on the ones you're supposedly covering.
Thanks, sis. You okay?
No, I'm angry.
RWBY then finally intervenes, and if her aim had been a little bit better, she might have been able to take Emerald out entirely. She then poses with her weapon behind her back, and if Mercury was smart, he'd have kicked her while her weapon was in a useless position.
Uh-oh, what are you gonna do now?
RWBY and Yang re-engage, and Mercury avoids RWBY's first swing, then manages to disarm her. Unfortunately for him, his ego is too great, and he elects to taunt his opponent instead of attacking her.
Whatever it takes to shut you up.
When he finally does throw his slow punch, RWBY manages to headbutt him. I'm a fan of headbutts, but you didn't need to hit him with the back of your head. You had already evaded his strike. You might as well have hit him with the front of your head. That, and Mercury just leaves his arm hanging out after he misses. Bad move, that. But we then cut back to Ren, who manages to evade some of Hazel's strikes. But there's more to this sort of fighting style than evading. You also have to attack back, or else you're not doing anything more than stalling. Ren pays for this by getting hurled into a door and blasted with lightning.
Hiding behind the face of a child. A muscle acting must be stopped.
But Crow has reappeared, only to be hucked into the railing and become a sack of potatoes on the floor. Lionheart has reappeared as well, returned from whatever nether realm he vanished into. Hazel then demonstrates his complete lack of self-awareness. You don't want him to hurt a child, as you are actively beating a child to death. Do you not see the contradiction, my good man? Nora then abandons the element of surprise by screaming at the top of her lungs and jumping at Hazel in the most predictable fashion, and is rightly thrown to the ground for it.
How many more children must die for you?
But Hazel, thankfully, picked the single worst type of dust for this encounter, and inadvertently powers Nora up, and his lumbering charge is halted by her hammer, sending him flying through the wall. This is why you use a weapon and not your hands. They're more effective. That's why ancient people didn't go into battle with their fists. But what follows is the single worst part of the fight. Hazel is then impaled by a summon from a now recovered Weiss, but is fazed by it about as much as finding out that a bird has defecated on your windshield. The reason given is he's sheer willpower.
He's sheer willpower.
Well, I guess Pyrrha just wasn't angry enough. I guess Weiss a minute ago just needed to suck it up. Really? Sheer willpower lets you survive having something destroy your stomach, liver, or lungs? That's the general area where he was run through. I don't buy it, Chief. That should have been the end for Hazel. To be impaled, his aura should have been depleted, and thus his organs are gone. He's not recovering from that. It's over for him. But after the group sees Blake, for some reason they decide to have Yang, alone and unaided, to make for the elevator shaft. They have no way of knowing what's transpired down there. She could be walking right into Cinder's hands. Why is this happening? Emerald performs the most clumsy and inept attempt at a tackle that I have ever seen. And Mercury manages to grab Yang's prosthetic arm, which she detaches in order to escape. That should have been the last she ever saw of it, if we're being honest. If he could figure out how to fire it, then that would be one more weapon he could use against Yang's friends.
You guys okay?
But when we cut back to this fight, everyone's positions have now swapped. Hazel, Mercury, and Emerald are now by the door, while the others have spread out. But apparently, Hazel has a thing for catgirls, as when one steps on him, he just keels over.
Not today. All right. What's the plan, Ruby?
Ruby then somehow manages to shoot Lionheart's weapon, despite facing the wrong way entirely. And the remaining three enemies are just slow walking towards the main cast like they aren't outnumbered. The people of Menagerie have outnumbered the White Fang. Time is no longer on your side, but Lionheart flees the scene, removing him from this fight now.
You've got to be kidding me.
Ruby, Weiss, and Blake then rush Hazel, Emerald, and Mercury, but once we cut back to them, everyone has just stopped. What? There's no evidence to what went down, and with Hazel bellowing like a deranged wildebeest, you'd think that he wouldn't have just given up. But Yang returns with the relic, and that prompts Emerald to spaz and conjure an illusion of Salem. During that time, she, Mercury, and Hazel make their escape. One thing though, if you had the enemy subdued, why not have Mercury jump up there and grab the relic before you run off? He's been shown to be quick enough. But that concludes this fight. Honestly, it was a bit of a train wreck. Too many times characters just stood around, either talking or else doing nothing at all. But you might ask, how would I improve it? Well, let's look at what we've got. Firstly, I get that Jaune could easily be provoked by Cinder. However, RWBY has always been shown to be Cinder's target of revenge. She even states that she wants her alive before she goes down the elevator. She also knows that RWBY saw Pyrrha die, so have Cinder engage both Jaune and RWBY. Considering that she's capable of taking on the entirety of Team RWBY by herself in Season 8, then she shouldn't have much trouble against these two. Emerald would likely jump in as well, given her following Cinder like a puppy. Crow should be doing more here though. He's the only adult amongst this group, and as such, he has a responsibility to protect these kids. Have him engage immediately, but then he's confronted by Raven. I mean, Raven should have honestly not even helped Cinder, but I've got to play the cards I'm dealt. When Mercury tries to go for Yang, have Weiss intervene, as her glyphs would put her at an advantage against him, leaving Yang to fight Vernal. Also, don't have Weiss just stand there to be hit. Her display in this sequence was rather poor, to put it mildly. Hazel fighting both Ren and Nora still works, but let's actually see some of that fight, and don't make it so that he's just face-tanking everything. Give him a weapon of some sort. Oscar, having Ozma in his head, would likely still end up confronting Lionheart, but let's have Ozma take over immediately, and have Lionheart be able to go toe-to-toe with him. This would let us see sooner just what sort of things Ozma is capable of, and not make Lionheart look like an incompetent idiot. Then have it so that when Cinder sees what's going on, she orders Emerald to cover her descent down the elevator with illusions to distract the others, and she, Vernal, and Raven can escape. Then the resulting melee can involve all of the combatants fighting each other at once, switching targets as necessary. Weiss's impalement really only served as shock value. It left no long-term injury, be it physical or psychological, so we can remove it entirely. After all, there's no reason that Jaune needs to unlock his semblance right now. He could potentially do that either before or after this encounter. Then when the people of Menagerie subdue the White Fang, have Blake lead a group into the hall where then Yang and the rest of Team RWBY can confront Raven, leaving Crow, Oscar, and the Faunus to deal with the remaining enemies. Seeing as they'll be heavily outnumbered, that would put them on the back foot, and when Team RWBY arrives with the relic, it will make more sense for them to flee. But these are just my observations and thoughts. What were yours? How would you improve this sequence? This was the last option of my previous poll, and so next month's RWBY Revisited will be on Huntsmen and Huntresses according to your votes. But I'd like to thank you for watching. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and leave a like if you're so inclined, and subscribe to see more. And may you all have a weapon in each hand.